Well, I think the question that was posed was, how does Africa remove some of the obstacles to industrialization and intra-African trade? And I made three quick points. One is that industrialization requires quite consistent government policy, and gave the example of South Africa, where our industrialization wasn't just by chance. It was many, many years of industrial policy, including after 1994. So I said one of the weaknesses in Africa is kind of inconsistent policy, doesn't get implemented for long enough. And then made the point that the world's changed with the big industrialization of China and India and Brazil. We in Africa, if we want to industrialize, we're going to have to form partnerships. So clearly South Africa plays an important role there because it's got a fairly high degree of industrialization, but we're going to have to form partnerships, and the partnership between ECIC and Exim Bank on financing, I think, is an excellent initiative. And then made the point that in the Continental Free Trade Agreement, we must, at the same time as we're dealing with the free trade, at the same time must have a parallel process as part of it, dealing with industrial policies, because those are somewhat more complex than a free trade agreement. So we'd be looking at various types of industrial partnership in complex industries, like telecommunications came up in the discussion. We are looking at the prospects of how we could form some partnership in the automotive sector across Africa. So that was what we covered.
And then when we look at free trade, what are some of the policies that get in the way in enabling free trade?
Well, the basic concept of an African free trade agreement is that we may have tariffs towards other non-African economies, but inside we would slowly move towards reducing the tariffs between us. So the obstacles are what many of the other speakers pointed to. A lot of the basic infrastructure for intra-African trade is not yet strong enough. And then many of the soft infrastructures, the customs administration, identifying goods, documentation, we're still not strong enough on that. So it's easier for people to trade, say, with China than it is to trade inside of Africa, and we've got to reverse that by developing both the hard infrastructure, roads, railways, airports, telecommunications infrastructure. That was a very interesting question that came up, and a number of the speakers pointed out that basically the infrastructure in Africa for telecommunication is still too weak. It's not strong enough for us to carry the big data systems that we need.
And where do the opportunities lie for South African export, looking into the African continent?
Africa is the single biggest opportunity in the world for industry. The reason for that is we've got the least developed infrastructure. So if we want to get to basic industrial activity, there's gigantic expenditure on infrastructure. Now, if we form clever partnerships, instead of importing all that equipment, we can start manufacturing it ourselves. So we're the last great opportunity for the development of an industrial age. Doesn't mean we won't use the fourth revolution. That will help us as we industrialize now. We're going to industrialize more efficiently than the previous eras were, because we've got access to this technology. But we have to put in the fourth revolution, industrial revolution, whatever it's called, will not come by itself. It needs infrastructure there.
And then how do we ensure that platforms such as this don't just end up being another talk shop, and instead come up with tangible goals and solutions going forward?
Well, I think for me there were two things that I was pleased to hear. One is that we now have a much bigger platform in Africa under the Continental Free Trade Agreement umbrella, where we could start some really serious continental partnership discussions, not just on the free trade. Because in every free trade agreement, there's always some part of it which deals with exceptional industries or industrial policy or whatever. So that was a good thing. Second thing is, I was teasing them a little bit and saying this partnership between ECIC and I'm glad it's here, but it's come too late, took them too long. So we're starting to see a much more effective partnership arrangement between the African Export-Import Bank and the ECIC, which should be of great benefit to South African companies.